On the morning of April 18th, 1955, something very strange happened at Princeton Hospital. Albert Einstein had died during the night from a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, a ballooning of the main artery that he had refused to have surgically repaired. He knew the risks. He said he didn't want to artificially prolong life. Very Einstein, calm, stubborn, and absolutely uninterested in drama. He had also left crystal clear instructions for what should happen next. No mausoleum, no crowds, no saint-like treatment of his remains. Cremate the body, scatter the ashes, move on. A clean exit. Except that, if you know a bit about Einstein's story, you already know that's not what happened. Because when the hospital staff prepared to follow his wishes, someone noticed a small detail missing from the body. His brain. Not figuratively, the organ itself was gone. And within hours, that brain, possibly the most famous in the world, was sitting in a jar of formalin inside the trunk of a doctor's Buick. No escort, no security, no official authorization. Just a local pathologist driving across New Jersey with Einstein's brain sloshing softly behind him, as casually as if he were transporting leftovers. This is the paradox that defines the entire story. Einstein, the man who tried all his life to demystify genius and humanize science, instantly became an object of anatomical obsession. His brain turned into a scientific relic, studied, sliced, photographed, debated, and at times literally mailed across the United States in padded envelopes. A relic he never wanted preserved in the first place. It's one of the strangest post-mortem adventures of the 20th century. A road trip involving jars and refrigerators, academic ambition, questionable ethics, misfiled specimens, magazine reporters, and scientists desperately hoping the tissue would reveal the secret of genius. To understand how Einstein's brain went from a quiet hospital room to a 40-year wandering odyssey, we need to return to the moment one man, standing over Einstein's body, made a decision that would change everything. The man standing over Einstein's body was Dr. Thomas Stoltz Harvey, the hospital's chief pathologist. Harvey was not a celebrity in the medical world, nor a rising star, nor even someone with a particular specialty in neuroanatomy. He was competent, steady, respected by his colleagues, the kind of doctor who kept a low profile and did his work without fanfare. In other words, not the sort of person you'd expect to change the course of scientific folklore. The autopsy began at 8 a.m. It was routine at first. Harvey noted the aneurysm, the rupture, the bleeding. Einstein's organs were examined and measured. The procedure could have ended there, quietly, exactly as Einstein had requested. But then, Harvey reached the skull. Accounts differ slightly about what he was thinking at that moment. Later in life, Harvey would insist that he acted for science, that no one else in the room had the courage to do what needed to be done. Others believed it was an impulse, not malicious, but driven by a kind of opportunistic certainty that he was witnessing the death of an irreplaceable mind. Whatever the motive, Harvey made a decision. He sawed open the cranium, lifted the bone flap, and removed the brain. Einstein's final wish was crossed in a single gesture. Harvey placed the organ in a basin of formalin and set it aside. And just like that, the pilgrimage began, though Harvey didn't know it yet. After the autopsy, he did something even more surprising. Instead of notifying Einstein's family first, he walked the brain down the hospital corridor, past the nurse's station, and into his office. There, according to later interviews, he simply sat with it, turning the jar in his hands, studying it, trying to decide what came next. Outside, the world had no idea anything unusual had happened. By the afternoon, Einstein's son, Hans Albert Einstein, arrived from California. Harvey informed him of the autopsy results, and only then mentioned that he had removed the brain for scientific study. Hans Albert hesitated. His father had been clear about privacy, but the idea of contributing to a better understanding of human intelligence appealed to him. After a long pause, he gave a conditional approval. The brain could be studied, but only by reputable scientists, and only if the results were eventually published. Harvey agreed, but there was a problem. Actually, many problems. He had no formal research plan, no grant, no neuroanatomy lab, no institutional backing from Princeton, no credentials as a brain specialist, and most importantly, he had taken the brain before asking permission. Yet Harvey pressed on, convinced he had done the right thing. In the days that followed, he photographed the brain from multiple angles, weighed it, and documented it. It came in at 1,230 grams, on the smaller side for an adult male, which surprised many later researchers who were expecting a massive organ. Harvey then carefully cut the brain into 240 blocks, each a few centimeters thick, and embedded them in celloidin, a hardening medium. From these, he prepared hundreds of thin slices that could be mounted onto microscope slides. This was painstaking, meticulous work, but it still didn't answer the question no one else wanted to ask aloud. What was Harvey planning to do with all these pieces? Princeton University, once they found out, was far from impressed. They politely asked Harvey to hand the brain over to them. He refused. The hospital administration privately pressured him. He refused again. One colleague reportedly muttered that Harvey thinks he's Broca, referring to the 19th century French neuroscientist who built a legendary brain collection in Paris. Harvey didn't respond, but he didn't need to. He kept the brain anyway. Eventually, Harvey lost his position at Princeton Hospital. Not explicitly because of Einstein, but the controversy didn't help. He left with his jars, his slides, and his determination. His garage became his storage room. His kitchen sometimes became his lab. His home refrigerator occasionally held specimens next to vegetables. The brain was no longer part of an official medical inquiry. It had become one man's private project. And yet, bizarrely, Harvey wasn't behaving like a thief. In his mind, he wasn't hoarding the brain. He was safeguarding it. He began contacting scientists around the world, offering them sections of Einstein's tissue to study. Anatomists from Berkeley, neuropathologists in Philadelphia, researchers in Tokyo, anyone who seemed genuinely invested in understanding intelligence. Many accepted. Others declined, saying politely that they doubted anything special could be found in the tissue. But Harvey remained convinced that somewhere within those blocks of celloidin and those microscopic slices was an answer. The answer to a question that had haunted scientists for more than a century. What makes a genius? And that question didn't come out of nowhere. It had a much longer history, one that stretched far beyond Einstein, far beyond Harvey, and deep into the obsessive 19th century belief that the brain was a map of the soul. If Harvey's decision sounds shocking today, it's largely because we no longer live in a world obsessed with skulls and jars. But in the 19th and early 20th century, scientists, doctors, scholars, and even the general public were absolutely convinced that the brain, and sometimes even just the skull, could reveal every secret of human identity. Intelligence, morality, criminality, creativity, sexuality, courage, weakness, genius. All of it was thought to be legible in anatomy. A person's entire soul reduced to a physical map. So when Harvey stood over Einstein's body in 1955, he was not acting in a vacuum. He was standing on top of a century of scientific culture that told him, implicitly and explicitly, that preserving the brain of a great thinker was not only acceptable, but a duty. The obsession began in the early 1800s with the rise of phrenology. Today, phrenology is a punchline, a pseudoscience involving skull bumps and imaginary organs of the mind. But at the time, it was wildly influential. Phrenology parlors flourished in London and Paris. Portable phrenology kits sold like gadgets. Even respected figures flirted with the idea that the skull's surface reflected the shape of the brain underneath, and therefore, the mental faculties of the individual. Franz Joseph Gall and Johann Spurzheim published thick volumes describing how traits like benevolence, amativeness, and combativeness had physical locations that could be palpated like buttons. It was nonsense, but it was persuasive nonsense, and it normalized something. The idea that we should mine anatomy for clues about behavior. Then came the next wave. Beginning in the 1860s, European medicine experienced a kind of anatomical gold rush. Scientists began collecting skulls, skeletons, and brains on a massive scale. Paris became the epicenter. At the Société d'Anthropologie de Paris, founded by Paul Broca, one of the fathers of modern neurology, hundreds of brains were stored in glass jars. Criminals, artists, ordinary workers, infants, foreign soldiers, people labeled idiots and imbeciles, anyone whose remains could be acquired. Broca's own prized specimen was the brain of the novelist Anatole France, which he claimed weighed unusually little, prompting endless debates about whether brain size really correlated with intellect. This wasn't fringe behavior, it was mainstream science. Broca's cabinet of brains was a respected resource. Visitors came to admire it the way they might admire a gallery of paintings. Early neurologists believed that by comparing hundreds of brains, measuring weight, shape, sulci patterns, they could decode the biological roots of human difference. The obsession merged, dangerously, with emerging ideas about race and criminality. Cesare Lombroso, the Italian criminologist, argued that criminals were born, not made, and that their skull shapes revealed innate degeneracy. Museums in Turin, Vienna, and Berlin proudly displayed criminal skulls in their anthropology collections, reinforcing the belief that behavior flowed directly from anatomy. By the late 19th century, this worldview had spread everywhere. Brain size was measured in universities, in colonial expeditions, in military autopsies. The larger the brain, the greater the intelligence, so people said. When German poet and polymath Friedrich Schiller's skull was discovered and measured, newspapers reported it as if discovering the volume of the skull told readers something profound about genius. Even in the United States, the Smithsonian Institution amassed a vast collection of skulls and brains, often taken without consent from indigenous communities, enslaved people, the poor, the institutionalized. These specimens were cataloged and studied in the hope that biological truths about human groups could be extracted from anatomy. Many of those remains are only now being repatriated more than a century later. Into this environment came the cult of the genius brain. If the brains of criminals were collected to understand deviance, then surely the brains of great people should be collected to understand brilliance. The idea sounds absurd now, but at the time it was considered almost logical. If Shakespeare or Newton or Beethoven had unusual talents, maybe their brains had unusual structures. The most famous example before Einstein was Vladimir Lenin. In 1924, after the Soviet leader's death, his brain was sent to Berlin, where the neurologist Oskar Vogt established the Lenin Institute of the Brain. Vogt believed that genius came from complex pyramidal cells in the cortex. His team produced thousands of microscopic slices, publishing detailed maps of what they claimed were Lenin's superior neural networks. The Soviets, eager to immortalize Lenin scientifically, celebrated the findings uncritically. The institute became a place of pilgrimage for foreign scientists and a model for later brain studies. So by the mid-20th century, the belief that genius left an anatomical trace wasn't fringe at all. It was a well-funded, institutionally supported, culturally reinforced idea. Brain museums existed on every continent. Comparative anatomy was a respected discipline. The notion of the genius organ had been rehearsed for 100 years. And then, the 20th century gave scientists a new reason to hope. Advances in staining, microscopy, and neuroanatomy made it possible to see details Broca and Lombroso could only dream of. Researchers could now examine synaptic density, neural layering, glial distribution. If a secret existed, surely modern science could find it. Einstein's death, therefore, arrived at the perfect moment. His fame was unrivaled. His mind was universally considered exceptional. He was the poster child of the genius archetype. And unlike Newton or Beethoven, he was dying in an era where neuroanatomy had enough tools to study a brain in extraordinary detail. Harvey knew all this. He had read the journals. He understood the cultural script. In 1955, the idea that Einstein's brain should be studied wasn't outrageous. It was expected. What was outrageous, at least to us today, was that Harvey took on this mission alone, without approval, without a research background, and without a plan. But for him, influenced by generations of anatomists who believed that brains contain the blueprints of brilliance, the action felt justified. Einstein's brain, in Harvey's mind, was not just a human organ. It was a scientific opportunity, a historic specimen, the latest chapter in a long tradition of trying to read genius directly from tissue. And now that Harvey had preserved the brain, the next question naturally followed, the one every scientist, journalist, and curious observer would ask in the years ahead. What exactly were they expecting to find? That question would define the next stage of this story. Once Einstein's brain was in Harvey's possession, the world around him began doing something very human. It started constructing expectations. And those expectations converged into a single, irresistible idea that somewhere inside that organ, in one fold or ridge or microscopic arrangement, there must be a physical explanation for genius. The media certainly believed it. Within days of Einstein's death, newspapers speculated openly about the remarkable features his brain might reveal. A Time magazine article wondered if the seat of creativity might be found in its convolutions. The New York Times mused about the physiological basis of scientific imagination. No one had seen a single photograph or slice of tissue yet, but the public imagination had already spoken. Einstein's brain couldn't be normal. Scientists, too, were seduced by the promise. Even before Harvey finished preparing the specimen, researchers were writing to him, asking for tissue samples. Some wanted to examine the density of pyramidal neurons. Others wanted to study glial cells or compare the thickness of cortical layers in Einstein's frontal and parietal regions. A few simply wanted photographs. They weren't coordinated. There was no central project or collective plan, but they all shared a hope that one day someone might stumble onto an anatomical key that explained how Einstein thought the way he did. The parietal lobes became an early favorite. These regions, roughly located above the ears and extending toward the back of the skull, are heavily involved in spatial reasoning, mathematical visualization, and the mental rotation of objects, skills Einstein used constantly in his thought experiments. Many researchers believed that if there was a seat of genius, it must be here. So when grainy black and white photos of Einstein's preserved brain appeared in Harvey's 1985 paper with anthropologist Marion Diamond, they caused a stir. The study itself didn't claim miracles, only that Einstein had a higher ratio of glial cells to neurons in one region of his cortex. But the speculation it triggered spread quickly. Other scientists began comparing Einstein's photos to those of average brains. They highlighted what looked like extra folds, unusual curves, missing fissures, or expanded surfaces in his parietal lobes. A narrative formed. Einstein's parietal cortex was special, and it was so satisfying, so elegant. It fit almost too perfectly with his legacy. If a normal physicist learned by grinding through equations, maybe Einstein's brain had a built-in visual mathematical superpower, something that let him manipulate ideas like objects, twist them in his head, play with time the way others play with clay. Books repeated the hypothesis. Textbooks mentioned it. A documentary in the 1990s claimed that Einstein's unique parietal anatomy may have enabled his revolutionary insights. One neurologist told a reporter that the absence of a particular groove in Einstein's brain could have allowed greater connectivity between regions involved in abstract reasoning. Another suggested that an enlarged parietal surface area offered an expanded workspace for mathematical intuition. And why not? The theory was tidy, photogenic, easy to summarize. It made for great headlines and even better lecture slides. You could point to a printed photo of Einstein's brain, draw a circle around a region and say, here is where relativity was born. The allure wasn't really scientific, it was mythological. This was the age-old search for the spark of genius, now modernized with microscopes and lab coats. The idea that one man's extraordinary intellect had a physical signature appealed to everyone. It made genius feel concrete, measurable, almost collectible. Even Harvey, for all his stubbornness and idiosyncrasies, believed in the possibility. When asked years later why he held onto the brain for so long, he answered simply, "I wanted to see if there was something different about it." It's hard to blame him. The temptation was enormous. If he found that difference, his name, not Broca's, not Lombroso's, not Gall's, would be the one attached forever to the mystery of intellectual greatness. The cultural momentum was so strong that even minor findings were inflated. A 1999 study by Sandra Whittleson reported that Einstein's inferior parietal lobules were 15% wider than average. Newspapers treated this as near proof that the secret had been found. Another study pointed out a missing groove, the parietal operculum, and claimed it might have provided extra neural real estate. Photo analyses circulated claiming that Einstein's Sylvian fissure had an unusual trajectory. None of these details were remarkable on their own, but the narrative had already formed. One way or another, the anatomy was special. Yet underneath the excitement, something wasn't quite right. The story was too smooth, too coherent, too perfect to resist. And when stories are too perfect, science starts to get uncomfortable. Because the more researchers studied Einstein's brain, the more inconsistencies emerged. The more claims were made, the more they contradicted one another. And gradually, quietly, a realization began to take shape. The miracle explanation. The idea of a neat anatomical key to genius might be an illusion. And if that illusion cracked, the entire narrative built around Einstein's brain would crack with it. But the crack was coming. The illusion didn't crack all at once. It cracked slowly, piece by piece, as more scientists began receiving Harvey's slides and discovering that the neat, cinematic story of the special brain simply didn't hold up to scientific scrutiny. The first problem was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. No one could agree on what special meant. Every study used a different comparison group. Some compared Einstein to a dozen normal brains, others to a handful of elderly men. Others still used archival photographs or museum specimens prepared decades earlier under wildly different conditions. Many of the brains used as controls came from people whose medical or cognitive backgrounds were completely unknown. It was like comparing apples to oranges, to old pickles you found in the back of a fridge. And even the measurements themselves were inconsistent. One team reported that Einstein's parietal lobes were unusually wide. Another concluded they were perfectly average. A third noted a missing groove. A fourth insisted the groove was present, but distorted by post-mortem shrinkage. The discrepancies piled up. Then came the deeper issue. The more neuroscientists learned about the brain in general, the less any of these claims made sense. By the late 1980s, researchers were discovering that cortical folding varies enormously between individuals. The human brain is full of natural anatomical diversity. Some people have missing sulci, some have extra ones, some have asymmetrical hemispheres, some have unusual curves that mean nothing. One study in the early 1990s reported that up to a third of healthy adults have significant deviations from the standard cortical map. So even if Einstein did have an unusual bump or groove or curvature, how much did that really mean? Was it a feature of genius? A random variation? A developmental quirk? No one could say. And then there was the problem of shrinkage. Formalin preserves tissue, but it also dehydrates it. Depending on the concentration and exposure time, brains can shrink dramatically. That alone made precise anatomical comparisons nearly impossible. Still, the biggest blow came from developments in neuroscience itself. As the field moved towards cellular and computational approaches, the premise of the entire Einstein project began to wobble. Brains are plastic. They rewire throughout life. They grow new connections, prune old ones, strengthen pathways the more they're used. Einstein had spent decades thinking visually, manipulating geometric diagrams, running mental simulations of trains, clocks, light beams, elevators, accelerating frames. Even if his parietal cortex were different, how could anyone tell whether it was a cause of genius or a consequence of a lifetime of intense, specialized thinking? The neat narrative, the idea that genius is something you can photograph, measure, circle with a red pen on a diagram, was evaporating. Harvey himself sensed it. In the 1980s, when asked whether he had found anything remarkable, he hesitated. "Not yet," he would say quietly. It wasn't the triumphant declaration people imagined. It was a gentle acknowledgement of a possibility he didn't want to accept. Because for all the news headlines, documentaries, and bold claims, the truth was becoming increasingly clear. There was no anatomical smoking gun, no genius bump, no magic fold, no structural mutation. The miracle explanation was nothing more than a comforting story told in the absence of real understanding. By the early 1990s, neuroscientists began admitting openly what they had whispered privately for decades. Einstein's brain, as far as anatomy could show, was normal. Not average exactly. No two brains are truly average, but not uniquely extraordinary in any way that could explain relativity, the photoelectric effect, or the unification of space and time. And if the answer wasn't in the tissue itself, then the problem wasn't with Einstein's brain at all. The problem was with us, with the way we interpret brains, intelligence, and genius. That realization was uncomfortable, but it opened a door the story had been avoiding from the beginning. Because Einstein's brain wasn't just a failed scientific relic, it was a mirror held up to the assumptions of an entire century. Einstein's brain didn't just expose the limits of anatomy, it exposed the limits of our expectations, the hidden biases that shaped the entire quest from the moment Harvey lifted the skull cap. The first of those biases was something surprisingly simple: the relic instinct. Humans have always preserved the remains of extraordinary figures. Medieval Europe kept saints' bones in golden reliquaries. Ancient China guarded the tombs of philosophers and emperors. The hair of writers, the quills of poets, the rifles of generals. History is full of objects turned sacred simply because their owners radiated importance. Einstein, despite hating this instinct, was no exception. The second he died, people wanted a piece of him. Harvey wasn't an outlier. He was just the first person who acted on an impulse shared by millions. But the relic instinct wasn't the only bias at play. There was also the great man narrative, the idea that world-changing ideas come from isolated geniuses who stand above their time, almost like natural wonders. In that worldview, genius is innate, singular, biological. Something you're born with, not something shaped by education, environment, opportunity, or collaboration. Einstein was the perfect canvas for this myth. He looked the part: wild hair, disheveled clothes, a violin under one arm, and cosmic equations under the other. People wanted a biological explanation because the story felt incomplete without one. Then there was something subtler, but even more powerful: anchoring. The first claims about Einstein's parietal lobes landed in the scientific community like anchors dropped in the sand. Even when later evidence contradicted them, people's minds kept drifting back to those early, seductive ideas. Researchers who examined the brain decades later sometimes unconsciously framed their findings around those initial pictures Harvey released. They weren't trying to deceive anyone. It's simply how the human mind works. First impressions stick. Another bias came from Harvey himself, although he didn't intend it. Because he controlled access to the brain, the research landscape was warped from the start. Scientists couldn't simply request a sample through institutional channels. They had to contact Harvey personally, sometimes multiple times, sometimes by writing letters to whatever clinic or factory he happened to be working at that year. Many never heard back. Others were given tiny fragments or incomplete slides. A few received samples that were mislabeled or degraded. Entire avenues of research were determined not by scientific priorities, but by a man who was juggling divorces, job changes, cross-country moves, and a growing sense of isolation. Even the way Harvey distributed the tissue introduced bias. He favored anatomists who already believed in structural differences. He was less enthusiastic about sharing samples with skeptics, not because he was malicious, but because he genuinely wanted the project to succeed, and, as a result, unintentionally nudged it toward confirmatory results. There was also a deeper structural issue, one that most people didn't talk about at the time. The comparison brains, the normals, used as controls, came from a scientific tradition with a long, troubling history. Anthropology museums in Europe and America contained vast collections of skulls and brains taken disproportionately from marginalized communities: indigenous people, enslaved people, colonized populations, and the institutionalized poor. These specimens were rarely treated with dignity. Many remained unidentified. Their presence as reference material shaped the baselines of 20th century neuroscience in ways no one properly addressed. So when scientists compared Einstein's brain to an archive sample from Broca's collection, or a slide from a Smithsonian jar, they weren't comparing Einstein versus the average human. They were comparing Einstein versus a skewed historical sample filled with ethically dubious remains, often taken without consent and preserved with outdated methods. The control data was compromised before the analysis even began. And then there was the bias baked into the very question being asked. Everyone, from Harvey to journalists to seasoned neuroscientists, assumed that if Einstein was brilliant, then something had to look different in the tissue. They weren't testing whether genius left a trace. They were searching for the trace they already believed existed. This is one of the oldest traps in science, assuming the answer must lie where you're looking. Einstein's brain became the perfect case study in how cultural expectations shape scientific inquiry. The researchers weren't doing bad science. They were doing science under the gravitational pull of a myth. And myths are powerful forces. They bend interpretation, shape priorities, and color conclusions. It wasn't until later, as neuroscience evolved beyond the 19th century fixation on anatomical differences and toward dynamic models of cognition, that the entire field began to realize something uncomfortable. The real problem wasn't that Einstein's brain failed to reveal its secrets. It was that we had been asking the wrong kind of questions all along. And once neuroscience started asking different questions, everything changed. By the time the 1990s arrived, neuroscience had quietly entered a new era, one that had little patience for miracle grooves or oversized lobes. For decades, anatomical studies had circled around Einstein's brain like moths around a lamp, each new claim contradicting the last. But outside that small circle, research was exploding in directions that made the entire Einstein quest feel strangely outdated, almost quaint. The shift began with new tools. Magnetic resonance imaging introduced the ability to see the living brain in action, a revolution that Paul Broca could never have imagined. And then came functional MRI, fMRI, which didn't just show anatomy, but activity. Which regions lit up during language, memory, problem-solving, music, fear, planning, creativity. Suddenly, neuroscientists were watching thoughts in motion. The picture that emerged was nothing like the tidy map people had been trying to draw from Einstein's preserved tissue. Intelligence wasn't a special region. It was a pattern, a choreography spread across networks. Neuroplasticity studies showed that the brain rewires itself constantly, that practice changes structure, that expertise sculpts anatomy rather than the other way around. Musicians developed thicker motor cortices. Taxi drivers in London showed enlarged hippocampi after years navigating complex city grids. Bilinguals had increased density in language networks. Chess players showed differences in pattern recognition hubs. These variations didn't precede learning, they followed it. In other words, if Einstein had unusual features in his parietal cortex, they might have been the result of decades spent visualizing geometry and physics, not the cause. Then researchers turned toward a new concept, connectomics, the mapping of the brain's wiring. Here the field found something fascinating. The efficiency of a brain, how quickly it routes information, how flexibly it shifts between networks, how densely its hubs are interconnected, mattered far more than the size or shape of a single region. Some individuals with average anatomical structures displayed extraordinary cognitive skills simply because their neural networks were well-tuned, balanced, and adaptable. Einstein's brain, sliced into thousands of static pieces, couldn't reveal any of that. A preserved organ stops being a network. It becomes a fossil, a map without motion, a circuit board without electricity. The living symphony of his thoughts, the dynamic reconfigurations that allowed him to build mental models of physical reality, died with him. Studies of working memory added to the evolving picture. Intelligence, researchers argued, depended heavily on how well a person could maintain, manipulate, and update information in real time. This wasn't something you could find in a fold of cortex. It was emergent, a property of entire systems interacting. Then came creativity research. Neuroscientists discovered that creativity came not from a single creative center, but from the interplay between three major networks: the default mode network, mind-wandering, imagination; the executive control network, focus, reasoning; and the salience network, switching between internal and external attention. People who could toggle efficiently between these modes tended to produce novel ideas. Einstein was famous for his Gedanken experiment, or thought experiments. He imagined riding on beams of light, falling in elevators, twisting clocks in motion. These weren't mere calculations. They were mental simulations, deeply visual, deeply creative. And modern neuroscience suggests that this ability likely came from dynamic interaction between his internal imagination networks and his executive reasoning networks. Nothing in his preserved brain could possibly reveal that. Other discoveries further undermine the old anatomical hunt. Glial cells, once considered passive support structures, turned out to play critical roles in learning, speed, and synaptic coordination. Gene expression patterns in the brain, influenced by environment, stress, nutrition, and experience, shaped neural architecture in ways that no static specimen could capture. By the late 2000s, scientists studying intelligence were looking at whole brain models, computational theories, genetic predispositions, environmental influences, developmental trajectories. They were writing papers with titles like Network Neuroscience and Emergent Intelligence. The days of pointing to a single lobe and declaring, "Here lies genius," were over. All of this made the Einstein story feel more and more like a relic itself. Not a scientific breakthrough, but but a cultural artifact from a time when people believed that genius could be trapped in a jar. And yet, the shift in thinking didn't make the story less interesting. It made it more interesting, because it pointed to a truth that the old anatomical model had been blocking from view. Intelligence wasn't a quirk of biology, frozen in tissue. It was a living process, shaped by history, by imagination, by effort, by curiosity, by collaboration, by experience, by culture, and by something even stranger, something that Einstein himself would have appreciated. The idea that intelligence isn't a point on a scale, but a spectrum, one that stretches far beyond humans. If you had asked scientists in the early 20th century what made Einstein unique, they would have pointed confidently to human exceptionalism. Humans, they said, were the only truly intelligent species. The rest of the animal kingdom was clever at best, instinctual at worst. But as the century progressed, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Cognition wasn't humanity's exclusive club, and once researchers began studying animal intelligence with the same seriousness they once reserved for human geniuses, things got messy, beautifully messy. Start with birds. If brains were the key to intelligence, then birds should be hopeless. Their brains are much smaller than ours and organized completely differently. And yet, crows and ravens began doing things that forced scientists to rewrite textbooks. In one famous experiment from the University of Oxford, a New Caledonian crow named Betty bent a straight piece of wire into a hook to retrieve food, spontaneously, without training. In another, crows dropped nuts onto a crosswalk, waited for cars to run them over, and then waited again for the red light before safely retrieving the cracked shells. These weren't instinctual behaviors. They were planned, innovative, and generalizable, the kind of things researchers once believed only humans could do. And the kicker? The neural architecture that supports this intelligence in birds isn't located in a cortex like ours, but in a completely different set of structures. A totally different design, same level of problem solving. Then came the octopuses. In the 2010s, marine biologists documented octopuses using coconut shells as tools, carrying them, assembling them, hiding inside them. Others figured out how to open child-proof jars from the inside. An octopus in a German aquarium learned to shoot jets of water at a light bulb to short-circuit it repeatedly because it found it annoying. Their brains are distributed throughout their bodies, with neurons in their arms capable of independent processing. They are, in a very literal sense, minds with 8 thinking limbs. Dolphins added another layer of complexity. They have signature whistles, essentially names, and appear to remember them for decades. They use tools in the wild, covering their snouts with sponges to forage on rough seabeds. They've been observed teaching hunting techniques to younger dolphins, passing knowledge through generations. That is culture, not instinct. Elephants too started to break the frame. In coordinated tasks, 2 elephants will wait patiently for a second rope to be pulled by a partner in order to retrieve food, an understanding of cooperation that even some primates fail. They recognize themselves in mirrors, mourn their dead, and can solve mechanical puzzles that stump children. And of course, the apes, our closest relatives, began to shatter the idea that certain cognitive skills were exclusively human. Chimpanzees in the Thai forest of Côte d'Ivoire use multi-step strategies to crack open hard nuts using stone hammers and anvils, techniques that vary by region and are passed down through social learning. In Japan, macaques learned to wash sweet potatoes in streams, then began salting them by dipping them into the ocean. The behavior began with one female and spread culturally, not genetically, exactly how humans spread habits. Some studies even found that chimpanzees can outperform humans in short-term memory tasks. In a famous Kyoto University experiment, a chimp named Ayumu remembered sequences of numbers on a screen faster than trained adult humans. His working memory, at least in that context, was superior. All of this forced a profound reconsideration. If intelligence is not tied to a single brain shape, or a single neural architecture, or a single species, then Einstein's genius can't be reduced to a structural anomaly on a preserved organ. His intelligence was extraordinary, yes, but it belonged to a continuum, a vast spectrum stretching across species that evolved different solutions to similar cognitive problems. This isn't about diminishing Einstein, it's about updating the story. His mind was brilliant, not because of a biological mutation that made him superhuman, but because he was part of a larger tapestry of minds, human, animal, and everything in between, capable of complex reasoning, creativity, and problem-solving. The more science looked beyond the human brain, the more it became clear that genius was not a single point at the top of a ladder. It was a branching network, a bush full of diverse cognitive strategies. And with that new perspective came a question far more interesting than the old one. If intelligence is a spectrum and not a hierarchy, what does that say about the way we define genius and the way we define ourselves? Once scientists accepted that genius wasn't hiding in a fold of cortex, a deeper, more unsettling question began to emerge. If Einstein's brilliance wasn't etched into his anatomy, then what exactly is genius? For more than a century, people had chased an answer that felt intuitive. Genius was innate, preloaded, a gift, a spark, something you could, in theory, bottle, preserve, examine under a microscope, something that lived in tissue, something you were born with. But as neuroscience, psychology, anthropology, and evolutionary biology converged, that story began to dissolve. Genius stopped looking like a property and started looking like a process, something fluid, emergent, and relational. The first major shift was the realization that intelligence isn't housed in a location. It's distributed. The brain is not a machine with separate rooms labeled math, art, sympathy, and time dilation. It's a dynamic system where ideas emerge from interaction, not isolation. Meaning arises from networks talking to each other, memory with perception, imagination with decision-making, emotion with logic. Einstein's equations weren't produced by a math center. They emerged from a lifelong conversation between visual imagination, intuition, pattern recognition, stubbornness, creativity, and a willingness to play with ideas like toys. That interplay is something no autopsy can capture. The second shift came from studies of creativity and innovation. Psychologists discovered that creativity isn't a mysterious gift bestowed on a chosen few. It's a byproduct of how the brain transitions between internal and external modes of attention. People who generate novel ideas tend to slip easily between focused reasoning and free-floating daydreaming. They don't have a special brain region, they have a special way of navigating mental space. Einstein said it himself many times, "I have no special talent, I am only passionately curious." He wasn't being modest. He was describing what modern neuroscience calls divergent thinking, the ability to recombine ideas in unconventional ways. Then came a third revelation, one Einstein would have appreciated: context matters. Genius isn't just about the mind, it's about the environment that nurtures that mind. Einstein had an unconventional education, enormous intellectual freedom, mentors who encouraged him, and access to cutting-edge scientific debates. He lived in a moment when physics itself was transforming, and he was embedded in networks of thinkers who challenged Newtonian intuition. Would Einstein have become Einstein if he had been born into a different circumstance? A poor village, a war-torn region, an era with no scientific infrastructure? Probably not. Not because he would have been less intelligent, but because genius needs space to grow. That realization leads to a more uncomfortable question. How many potential Einsteins are never recognized because they never receive the chance to cultivate their gifts? Genius may be rare, but opportunity is rarer. The brain may be capable of extraordinary feats, but society often restricts who gets to discover those capacities. And then there is the myth of the solitary mastermind, the great man model that shaped the entire Einstein brain obsession. Modern science tells us this model is inadequate. Einstein's breakthroughs weren't produced in isolation. Relativity emerged from decades of work by mathematicians, philosophers, experimental physicists, and astronomers. He had heroes, rivals, collaborators. He borrowed ideas, refined them, transformed them. Genius, in this sense, is a network phenomenon, an individual mind amplified by a culture of exchange. This doesn't diminish Einstein. It situates him where he belongs, in a web of ideas and influences that spanned continents and generations. Every discovery was an intersection of countless threads. The final blow to the old story came from evolutionary biology. Humans evolved intelligence not as a tool for producing physics theories, but as a tool for surviving social complexity, for building alliances, navigating hierarchies, understanding others, solving practical problems. Intelligence is a byproduct of cooperation, conflict, storytelling, imitation. and genius is simply the tail end of that distribution, an extreme expression of cognitive capacities shared by the entire species. Einstein was extraordinary because he pushed those capacities to their limits, not because he possessed a biological system others lacked. He didn't have a different kind of brain. He had a different way of using a brain all humans share. All these realizations lead to a final shift, a philosophical one. If genius isn't a relic in a jar, if it isn't a physical anomaly, if it isn't a biological accident, then what is it? Maybe it's a pattern. Maybe it's a story. Maybe it's a kind of motion, a way the mind dances with ideas. Maybe it's a structure built from curiosity, patience, imagination, and time. Or maybe it's something simpler, the ability to see differently. Which brings us back to the brain in the jar. Einstein's preserved tissue didn't reveal a secret because the secret was never in the tissue. It was in the living mind, in the process, not the anatomy. And once that becomes clear, the story of Einstein's brain stops being a scientific mystery and becomes something else entirely, a reflection of our own need to explain brilliance, to tame it, to pin it down, to turn it into something measurable. But there is one final chapter to this pilgrimage, and it begins with a knock on a door in the middle of Kansas. By the late 1980s, the story of Einstein's brain had faded into odd rumors, academic footnotes, and the occasional mention in a neuroscience textbook. Most people assumed the brain had been lost, or quietly sealed in a vault, or destroyed. It seemed destined to become a minor curiosity in the history of science, a strange but forgettable epilogue to Einstein's life. And then, a journalist went looking for it. In 1989, Stephen Levy of the New Jersey Monthly tracked down a rumor that the brain was still somewhere in the United States, not in a university, not in a museum, but in the possession of a private citizen. Levy followed the trail through phone calls, dead ends, distant acquaintances, and old hospital contacts. Finally, someone whispered a name: Thomas Harvey. No one had seen him in years. Some believed he had left medicine altogether, but a Kansas address turned up, and Levy decided to knock. He found Harvey living in Wichita, working in a medical lab that processed biological samples for factories. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't prestigious. It wasn't the career path people had imagined for the man who once autopsied Einstein. But the jars had followed him anyway. On a shelf behind Harvey's desk sat 2 cloudy containers, a few cardboard boxes, and several large jars filled with what looked like cloudy liquid. Inside them, after all those years, was Einstein's brain. Harvey wasn't hiding it anymore. He talked freely, offering Levy a guided tour of the specimen. The jars clinked softly as he opened them. There were the pieces, pale, sponge-like blocks floating in formalin. There were the slides, hundreds of thin slices wrapped in paper envelopes, marked with faded penciled labels. There were the photographs he had taken in 1955, still crisp, still haunting. Levy asked the question everyone wanted to ask: why keep it? Harvey didn't give a dramatic answer. He didn't defend himself. He didn't invoke destiny or genius or history. He just said, with a kind of quiet stubbornness, that he believed the brain still had something to teach science. That maybe he had mishandled things, maybe he had been too protective, maybe he hadn't known how to conduct the research properly, but he had wanted to understand Einstein's mind, and he hadn't been ready to give up. After the article was published, Harvey faced renewed scrutiny. He grew older, the jars grew cloudier. The brain fragments sat in cardboard boxes under his bed, on closet shelves, in the back of his fridge. Eventually, Harvey realized his stewardship had run its course. He contacted Princeton. Quietly, discreetly, without ceremony, he returned what remained of the brain to the university, where Einstein had spent the last decades of his life. Today, most of it is preserved at the Princeton Medical Center archives, handled with care when researchers request access, though few studies are conducted anymore. A few fragments remain elsewhere: a small collection at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, several slides in the hands of retired scientists, and a few samples scattered through private collections whose origins trace back to the days when Harvey mailed tissue by envelope. No great revelation ever came from any of it. No hidden pattern, no key to brilliance, no blueprint of relativity. Einstein's brain never surrendered a secret because the kind of secrets people expected weren't there. And yet, the story doesn't feel like a failure. It feels like a transition from an era that believed genius could be dissected under glass to an era that understands the mind as something more fluid, more collaborative, more unpredictable. The pilgrimage of Einstein's brain is strange, sometimes absurd, occasionally unsettling, but it reflects something universal: the urge to understand what makes extraordinary ideas possible, the search for a map of human potential. In the end, the answer wasn't in the jar. It was in the questions the jar forced us to ask. Because once you strip away the myths, the relics, the jars, and the anatomical curiosities, you're left with a bigger mystery, one Einstein himself would have recognized. If genius doesn't live in the matter of the brain, if it can't be weighed or photographed, then what is the actual engine behind the ideas that reshape our world? That question doesn't close the story, it opens the next one. Before you go, I'm curious about something. If Einstein's brain didn't contain the secret of genius, where do you think extraordinary ideas really come from? Upbringing? Curiosity? Luck? Something else entirely? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to read what you think. And if you enjoyed this little detour through science and myth, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps, and it tells me you want more stories like this one.